Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Just Us Coordinating Council Speaker Series. My name is Tony McCray Jr., and I am the Interim Program Director on the Justice Initiatives team at the National League of Cities, as well as a founding member of the JCC. And I am honored to be with you today as moderator for what will be a dynamic and empowering conversation in this year's final installment of the Just Us Coordinating Council's Federal Speaker Series. The JCC, as many of you may know, is the first of its kind national policy table created by and for individuals impacted by the criminal legal system, such as myself. Over the course of the last year and a half, we have built a table where everyone is welcome and all who are invited have a seat. This is a table where collectively we can leverage our lived experience as the expertise it truly is. Today's speaker series features representatives from the Department of Transportation, Energy, and Housing and Urban Development. These experts will be highlighting critical federal resources and initiatives aimed at aligning new and existing resources with the needs of disadvantaged communities and persons with lived experience in the criminal legal system. I am honored to be joined today by our speakers, Paige Shevlin, Jasmine Methapara, and Shalaya Morissette. Before we dive into today's session, I wanted to take a moment to orient those of you joining us today to exactly why the JCC is truly a first of its kind approach to policy. Next slide. Oh, thank you for queuing that up. In April of 2023, the Just Us Coordinating Council was launched. It's a national collective led by systems impacted leaders, community members, and national organizations who no longer demand a seat at the table, but instead we are building our own. Next slide, please. Thank you. So briefly, let's talk about our why. So the voices of those most impacted by the criminal legal system have been missing and or excluded from decision-making tables. There is a persistent relationship between poverty, inequality, and mass incarceration. And for far too long, the people closer to the problem have been closer to the solution, but furthest from the resources and power to advance positive change. Shifting the status quo requires investing in the sustained leadership of people directly impacted by the criminal legal system and standing alongside them for us to propel change. Next slide, please. So our priorities. So to adequately start addressing the harms caused by the legal system, the JCC works to create pathways, access, and resources within each of the policy areas of collateral sanctions, housing, health and well-being, sentencing, and of course, employment. And let's keep employment in mind. Next slide, please. So our mission. Our mission is to enhance quality of life for justice impacted individuals and their communities in order to restore human dignity. We do this by dismantling the policies that uphold systemic oppression and marginalization that are rooted in racial inequities. Today's sessions focused on social supports for directly impacted families is key. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, we want to focus on employment today. And so I am going to read these because it is imperative to what we talk about today. So employment and training concepts essential to economic mobility are often limited both by fair chance landscapes as well as inadequate funding for community development. Both of these realities perpetuate cycles of racism and poverty. And three examples are skilled trades. Training providers may have carve-outs in place for certain conviction histories, and so everything is not included, so people are getting left out. County and city funding often is heavily skewed toward law enforcement versus community development. And I see that every day in my role here at NLC. And funding the federal government may not impact all communities as it was designed for. So the intention may be there, but the actual implementation and execution does not follow suit. Next slide, please. And of course, we center people. Today's session centers on those most impacted as we highlight new policies and resources, explore advocacy opportunities, and connect with partners from the federal government. And so that brings us to why we're here today. So at the onset of the current administration, President Biden issued Executive Order 14008, which in part established the Justice 40 Initiative. This policy portfolio formalized and expanded the work of select federal programs to ensure that a much wider array of government funding tackling everything from housing supply to energy and infrastructure was directly benefiting at least 40% of the communities that are most disadvantaged. So these dollars come from several landmark bipartisan pieces of federal legislation, including the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the American Rescue Plan. We know all too well, however, that the target communities are disadvantaged in part by many of the policies we have discussed on this webinar all year long, and that fill the pages of our report. Justice 40 related funding initiatives are exactly the type of investments we need to see in the community if we as persons with lived experience can ensure they are creating impact for all of us. So here to share more about their work and how transportation-based funds have been used to enhance equity for all is Paige Shevlin. She is a strategic advisor for infrastructure workforce development with the U.S. Department of Transportation. And Paige, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. Glad to be here to talk today about what we've been doing over the last 3 years as we've been implementing the bipartisan infrastructure law. I have been at the Department of Transportation basically since the infrastructure law was passed, and my job is solely focused on implementing that law in a way that creates good paying jobs with free and fair choice to join a union, as well as increases access to those jobs to groups that have traditionally been underrepresented in those fields. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did over the course of the implementation, and then I really want to focus on how that continues to have impact over the next few years. So we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. I think it's important to understand the way that the infrastructure law is segmented. So the U.S. Department of Transportation is responsible for putting out about $650 billion, and about half of that funding is formula funding that goes straight to state departments of transportation. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about that funding. The piece that we've been really focused on and the way that we can have the most impact is through the competitive dollars. So the competitive grants are about 125 billion of that 650. And at the very beginning of the implementation of the infrastructure law, we devised notice of funding opportunities that emphasized all the various priorities of the Biden-Harris administration, which includes Justice 40, includes jobs, climate. So again, I was responsible for the jobs piece. We wanted to make sure that every single competitive grant that we put out had a way of prioritizing applications and encouraging applications to have a workforce plan that is going to have a positive impact on underrepresented communities and that is going to create good jobs. You can see here some of the main competitive grants that I think are important to be aware of. RAISE is certainly the biggest, but those are smaller grants overall. There's a cap of 25 million on any individual grant. Whereas infra, mega, we have some projects that are $1 billion just for one project. And then we also have port programs, transit programs, and pretty much every agency is receiving funding under the infrastructure law. If you can go to the next slide. So what we did is we made sure that every single notice of funding opportunity had language around creating good jobs, expanding high quality training, and implementing policies that are going to promote hiring and retention of underrepresented workers. We developed a checklist that could be used in application. And the reason that I'm talking in a little bit of past tense here is I want to be clear, pretty much all of the funding for the bipartisan infrastructure law has been announced to be awarded. So that means that, we have announced a list of projects that are going to be selected. That doesn't mean that all the grant agreements have been signed, which is the next phase after it gets announced publicly and we say, we're going to give $1 billion to X project. There is a grant agreement that has to be signed. We are working diligently over the next few months to try and sign as many of the grant agreements as possible. But we have awarded we've announced the awards for almost all of the funds. So I want to emphasize that because unless there is a reauthorization of the bipartisan infrastructure law and there's like a part 2, I don't really think the focus should be on applying for programs and how we should be, how to apply for programs. I think the focus going forward from the community should be on making sure that the grants that have already been awarded are implemented. And so I want you to know that we have had these preferences in all of our grants, that any grant that was awarded asks in the grant agreement, there is an ask about what that grantee is doing to create good paying jobs and to expand hiring for underrepresented populations, and that work is going to be continuing. And I'm going to get to some specific examples later, but you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I was talking about the competitive funds, and I will come back to that. But the other pot of funding is formula funding, or funding that goes directly to an entity, most commonly the State Department of Transportation or a large a transit agency, right? Those are the two main entities that are receiving formula funds from the U.S. Department of Transportation. And state DOTs are receiving the vast majority of the funds. State DOTs are getting about $50 billion every single year. And one thing I like to emphasize is that under the bipartisan infrastructure law, the total that states are getting, the precise amount is 48 point something billion. Prior to the infrastructure law, it was 42 billion. So even when the infrastructure law expires, state DOTs will likely still be getting $42 billion every year for their infrastructure projects. And the bipartisan infrastructure law changed the law, the underlying statute around how those funds can be spent, to say that those funds could be spent on workforce development. So that will be true even when the bipartisan infrastructure law expires. Any funding that is going to the state departments of transportation will still have this flexibility that you see in front of you, that the state DOTs can spend their money on workforce development, which we have defined to mean supportive services that include not just traditional training and education activities, but tools, clothes, childcare, temporary lodging, counseling, which does mean mental health. I want to clarify that. And if you look at the case studies that I know will be included for participants in this series, there are examples of states that are currently using funds on mental health supports as well. There is a large degree of flexibility in how these funds are being spent. And the owner of these funds is the state DOT. So that's one thing I really want to leave you all with is, if you live in a state where you believe that your governor's office will be, interested in and willing to use these funds for workforce development, that is an important place to go, especially, what I would encourage, and let's go to the next slide. Let me see if I was smart enough to, this is a map of how much states are using this funding currently. So this will tell you how much money your state is actually getting annually from these highway funds that can be used on workforce development. And the reason there's a 0.5% target that's listed there is that the White House issued a call to action for states to spend 0.5% of their eligible dollars on workforce development. So you can see, for example, if you live in, I'm just going to pick Maine out because I was in Maine recently, that they're getting $240 million a year, and that, 0.5% goal would be 1.2 million for them. And you can see in the graph, in the chart that the states that are, more blue are using a lot of funding already. There's states that are, kind of shaded a lighter blue, which are using some funding. And then the states that are the lightest blue are not using anything, or they haven't told us they're using any money yet. So there's a lot of room for growth here, as you can see. What I was going to say is what I would recommend that you do is that you use resources to kind of understand. And I can put it in the chat later, but there's the Investing in America's website, for example, that shows all the projects that have been awarded under the Biden-Harris administration. You can look at all the projects that have been awarded in your area, look at the ones that are going through your state DOT. And then, when you in your engagement and advocacy with the state, say, here's some funds that could be used to support workers on these projects and to support workers getting the services that they need to be successful on these projects, right? Because we do allow for those supportive services. And if you go to the next slide, this is a just short summary of what we know about how states are spending these funds so far. There are deeper case studies of Maryland, California, and Oregon that I had sent out, but these are links to some of the programs that other states fund to be helpful to you. So I'll pick on Wisconsin for a second, since that's another one I know well. Like if you go to the Wisconsin, Highway Construction Skills Training Program, you can see that, they have a small, good program. They operate it in different, places across the state. It does not offer a lot of childcare, for example. It does not offer a lot of mental health counseling. So you could actually say, well, you have this program, but we'd really like to see it offer more services. We'd like to see it be able to serve more individuals who are justice impacted. And the other resource I want to point out that I want to make sure you all have is we produced a report on how to serve underrepresented populations and get them into good paying construction jobs. In that report was actually required by Congress as a part of the infrastructure law. And Congress asked us to look at 3 particular subpopulations. And one of those is individuals that are justice impacted. So we have a report with a set of recommendations just on, how construction workforce training can be effective for individuals that are justice impacted. I don't want to get too much into the details of that particular recommendation because you can read them all. And I think you all probably know way more about it than I do, to be honest. I think, as is often the case in workforce development, like we all know collectively what works. And the bigger issue is how do we get people to actually fund it? How do we get them to execute on it? So I do encourage you to look at those recommendations and to use those recommendations as a part of your advocacy, right? When you're saying like, we know what it takes to be effective. We know that these programs that are getting people into good paying jobs it costs a lot of money. They're spending money on things like childcare and mental health services and, and case management and, all these pieces that we know are important. Last slide. And then I think it's the last slide at least. So this is a very small print, but hopefully you'll be able to get it in bigger print. I wanted you all to see our biggest grants, individual projects that have committed to having hiring preferences. And I want to use this opportunity to talk about the potential of local hire, which is also something that you will find in that report. So the bipartisan infrastructure law allowed for the use of geographic and economic hiring preferences on all Department of Transportation projects that are funded under the infrastructure law. It's the first time ever that this was allowed. Prior to the infrastructure law passing, there were 16 pilot projects, and only 16 pilot projects that were able to use local hire. Because of the passage of the infrastructure law, we were able to encourage local hiring through our discretionary grant process. And we now have hundreds of projects across the country that are being, using federal funding, that are using local hire. The reason that this is important for this particular, audience, and for disadvantaged communities is local hire, or geographic and economic hiring preferences is the better way to say it, but it allows for targeting, for setting basically a quota. And it's okay for me to call it a quota, but because it's not based on race or gender, but it is based on economic indicators. And you can say, I want 40% of people on the project to come from these zip codes that are economically disadvantaged, or I want 30% of the project hours to be performed by people who are graduating from our public schools. I want it to be performed by people who are receiving public benefits. That's something else that's very common. So if you look at this report, which again, I will put in the chat and make sure you all have, we have a whole section on local hire and how local hire is being implemented in cities across the country. It is very common to call out individuals who are justice impacted as a priority group. I would say that's one of the most common ways in which local hire is implemented. And so that is a big opportunity to really make sure that people have access to work on these federally assisted projects. So what I've done here is I have all the projects that are big projects that have committed to using local hire preferences of some type on the project. And then the ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones that I have personally worked on during my time at DOT, and that I know have the greatest potential for success. So I am happy to talk about some of those in depth a little bit later. But right now I'll give the example of Philadelphia. So Philadelphia, we worked with them to create a local hire policy that is across all of their projects. Philadelphia has never really had a local hire policy before. So now all across $1 billion in funding that they are getting from the federal government, they are going to apply a standard policy across all those projects that requires that 50% of the apprentices come from economically disadvantaged zip codes, or that they come from a certain set of pre-apprenticeship programs. And if you look at those pre-apprenticeship programs, many of those pre-apprenticeship programs are serving individuals that are re-entering from the justice system. When you look at that list, I believe it's on Philadelphia's website, and I'll make sure to get that on here. But those are the specific programs that you could be working with to try and improve and expand their services, because those programs are now being called out in every single bid that goes out to contractors, saying, we want to make sure that you are employing people from these programs, that are graduates of these programs, and that live in these economically disadvantaged zip codes in Philadelphia. So I have great hope for the implementation of this policy in Philadelphia. The first bids should be coming out soon. And I also love that the city of Philadelphia is going to be collecting data on this. And I think that will allow for the community to really hold them accountable. And I would say that as another, call to action for all of you to ask your cities to share their information on who is working on their public projects. I have pretty much every city that I have ever asked to share their data with me, they have it and they've shared it. But is it posted online? No. Right? So it is not posted in a transparent way, but it is out there. And anything that we can do to shine light on those data, to understand the trends, how that workforce is changing over time, whether they are, actually seeing more people from, Black communities, Latino communities, certain disadvantaged zip codes, certain, parts of the city. Again, it depends on how they want to set up their preferences, or what communities you all they are trying to prioritize in their hiring. But if they're saying they're going to do it, then the data should show results, right? And someone needs to hold them accountable for that. So really excited to see how the work goes in Philadelphia. And there's some other cities on here to watch, which include Baltimore, where we got Amtrak to do their first ever local hire agreement. And that should be and Amtrak is also investing $5 million into the construction workforce training programs in Baltimore. So that's going to have a big impact in that city. We have Syracuse, which I think hopefully everyone knows about the great work that's been going on in Syracuse under the I-81 project, and that work is now going to be replicated in Buffalo, where they are going to have a similar sort of workforce training program and preferences that apply to the major Reconnecting Communities project that they are doing in Buffalo, which is listed on here. It's the Kensington Expressway project. This is, again, just a short list, but I think where some of the most transformational projects should be occurring. And I would point out that, and this is probably a good way to end, I work on jobs, on employment at the U.S. Department of Transportation, obviously. There's a whole other team that has spent, all of their time over the past 3 years in making sure that money for projects goes to disadvantaged communities in the first place, right? So that's a part of Justice 40 as well, is making sure that communities are seeing the money. So because that's kind of a precursor to actually being able to have some jobs impacts. And this Reconnecting Communities program in particular, if you haven't heard of it, is completely focused on how to address the ways in which transportation has often divided instead of connected communities, and fixing some of those areas and those transportation infrastructure where it is continuing to segregate communities. So, a Reconnecting Communities project with a local hire agreement, right, has the ability to be really transformational in a city, because it's about changing the way transportation supports the community as well as bringing jobs. So I think these are all really important projects to watch. And I will stop there and wait until there are some other questions. Thank you for your time.
We have time for your resource page.
My resource page. Yeah, this is everything. I'm going to be blunt here, y'all. If you want something, you should download it. I can't guarantee how much longer it's going to be on the internet. So first thing is we've got guidance on how the Federal Highway Administration funds can be spent on workforce development. We have a more detailed version of that that's specifically focused on how those funds can be used for youth and opportunity youth. We have various fact sheets from the White House. I've worked on 3 workforce hubs, which was a White House initiative, but one that DOT supported. The 3 hubs that I've worked on are Baltimore, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia. If you look at those individual websites, you can see the commitments. That's what I was talking about earlier. For example, what Philadelphia is doing on their local hire policy. You can see the commitment that Amtrak made to invest $5 million in Baltimore. Milwaukee, there's fantastic commitments that have been made by the city and by the sewerage district there that are focused on how they bring in more individuals from the Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership, which is a program that has a really solid reputation and experience in training disadvantaged individuals. The work in Milwaukee, maybe if we have time for questions, I'll go a little bit more into depth, because that's a really interesting hub. And I will say the city government there was amazing to work with. So I also have a lot of high hopes for them. And then this fact sheet from just last week, which really summarizes everything the administration has done around around workforce related to infrastructure. So that really should have everything. And then I will make sure to put in the chat the link to the report that I mentioned. and the link to the Investing in America site, where you can see all the funds that have been awarded.
Thank you, Paige. And concerning your comment, or regarding your comment around bluntness, keep that in mind. If we have time, I'm going to circle back and for all three of you, hopefully, and get some thoughts on around that specific theme there. Also, you stamped what I always tell people in our reentry network, that anything that says under-resourced, disadvantaged, marginalized, call out impacted people, just as impacted people as a group, right? And apply for it that way. So thanks for stamping that, even though I thought I made that up. But could you remind us, oh, and I do want to go back. You made it clear that the focus for the bipartisan infrastructure law is more about tracking the grants and how they're being slated, because the applying phase is done. And so I just want to thank you for making that clear. And then could you also clarify, remind us the difference between formula and competitive grants, and do they both provide opportunities for workforce related funding?
So the competitive grants do not have any funding for workforce development unless the city applied for it. And as much as I tried, very few cities jumped on this bandwagon. The only city that did is the city of Philadelphia. So the city of Philadelphia, for example, has $1.9 million just to spend on workforce as a part of its Chinatown Stitch Reconnecting Communities project. But unfortunately, other cities did not do that. And once the grant has been awarded, a city cannot spend any of the funds on workforce if it was not already in the budget. So but that's about funding. That's not about policies. I would say that your policies, when you put out a bid, are way more important than funding for workforce. And that includes local hire, or it includes, for example, what the city of Milwaukee is planning on doing, where they're going to say that 10% of 10% of the hours on the project across every single trade have to be worked by apprentices, and that half of those apprentices have to graduate from certified pre-apprenticeship programs. There's no money for that in those certified pre-apprenticeship programs, but from our research, and you can see this in our report, those policies that set the demand, that's how people frame it, right? Those policies set the demand for the workforce and say, we want underrepresented individuals to be working on our projects. We want individuals from these communities to be on our projects. We don't want our projects to be staffed by people who are coming from out of state, to be honest, right? We want them to be staffed by our local community. That is more important than funding for workforce development. And I'm saying that as someone who spent, 15 years working in the workforce development field. Those procurement policies are so important. And those procurement policies are going to be more innovative and have higher impact on the competitive grants and coming from cities. The money, the funds for workforce development that I talked about that are allowable for supportive services, for childcare, temporary lodging, that is formula funds that are going to the state DOTs. So the whole the biggest impact would be if you can get a state DOT to put out money, and you can get the city, the cities and the individual projects to have these requirements around hiring from certain communities or certain programs. And that's what you see in, state leadership that prioritizes this. Like, for example, Maryland, right? Maryland is going to be investing $4 million a year from their highway formula funds into workforce development. But at a city level, we also have individual projects, like the projects coming out of Baltimore, the Amtrak projects, that are then saying you have to hire people from these disadvantaged zip codes. And that's kind of like the magical combination there.
Thank you. And you can see that Shalea put a comment with the definition of each up there. Thank you very much. And if you get whole page, we'll come back for some Q&A at the end, hopefully, and get back to your blunt answers for me. We'll transition over to Jasmine. While many in our communities are acquainted with the Housing and Urban Development Act Section 8 policies, also tucked within this law is a much lesser known and underutilized source of community development and economic opportunity. Section 3 of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, amended by the Housing and Community Development Act of 1992, promotes stronger, more sustainable communities by directing, where possible, employment and economic opportunities for federal housing and community development funds to low and very low income individuals, especially those receiving government housing assistance. So Jasmine Mathapara is a management and program analyst with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and is here to share more about Section 3 opportunities in communities across the country and how local housing authorities can utilize them to create impact. Jasmine, welcome, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. We've given the full introduction there. So, within HUD, I am the Section 3 program manager, which is tucked in the Office of Field Policy and Management. We work in coordination with a number of our other program offices, but we serve as the lead in HUD for our Section 3 program. Next slide, please. So every year, HUD awards billions of dollars for community development and funds projects that create jobs and contracting opportunities for underserved communities. The intention of Section 3 is to direct these economic opportunities generated by HUD funding to low and very low income persons, particularly those who are recipients of government housing assistance. Essentially, we want to keep HUD dollars local. We want to ensure that when we invest in a community, we're not only investing in the infrastructure and the buildings, but also in the people. Next slide, please. It's important to also note that Section 3 is not a grantee requirement. It's not just that, but it's a path towards self-sufficiency. It's not an initiative. It's a provision of HUD law. And it can often get conflated with funding. We serve the grantees. The grantees are the ones that receive the money, but Section 3 itself is not a funded program. It is a rule that's applied to different funding programs within HUD. Next slide, please. And as I said earlier, the intent is to provide economic opportunities to HUD-assisted households, and not just directly through construction jobs, though primarily you'll see that as an outcome of Section 3 implementation, but it's also related to the jobs surrounding HUD projects or even public housing authority day-to-day operating needs. There's a long list at the bottom of this slide that encompass the various tasks and jobs that could be triggered by Section 3. So, you have administrative, clerical work, you have the construction that I had alluded to earlier. In addition, there's, carpentry, HVAC, drywall, masonry. So some of it is specialized. And then also, labor, just general contract, construction, labor, but then also payroll, right? So it runs the full gamut. And, we're trying to ensure that the dollars that we spend in these communities, once again, stays there. Next slide, please. So Section 3 applies to projects that are fully or partially funded with HUD financial assistance. So for grants that our communities receive, if they braid them with other local grants or other federal grants from other agencies, if HUD dollars are applied, Section 3 can apply, given the other constraints around it. Projects that are financed with state, local, or private matching or leveraged funds used in conjunction with HUD funding are covered by Section 3 if the amount of HUD funding for the project exceeds the regulatory thresholds. So we need to be mindful of the amount of money that's being assigned from HUD here. Next slide, please. So this is where applicability falls in. Now, Section 3 has evolved since 1965. Per the final rule that we're currently under, which was issued in 2020, Section 3 covers all public housing financial assistance. including but not limited to operations, maintenance, development, modernization, and management assistance. So no matter how much money is given to a public housing authority, all of those funds, if labor is involved in some capacity, is subject to Section 3. And within the housing and community development's financial assistance space, we have money there that's expended towards housing rehabilitation, housing construction, or other public construction. And that is not applicable to Section 3 in all cases. It's project-based. So it depends on the source of funding there. Section 3 will only apply to projects that meet specified thresholds. Not only do they need to fall under the scope of some sort of general public construction, but when the total amount of housing and community development assistance to the project exceeds the threshold of $200,000 or $100,000 when the assistance comes from the Office of Lead, Hazard, and Healthy Homes, then Section 3 applies. But it needs to meet those those minimum funding requirements. So $100,000 for lead, and then $200,000 for any other public construction. And a lot of this money comes from formula grants, competitive grants. You may have heard of the CDBG program or Community Development Block Grant, HOME, HOPWA, ESG, or Choice Neighborhoods. Those are all examples of grant programs for which Section 3 can apply. Next slide, please. So in understanding how to apply Section 3, we need to look at the specific terms that are involved. We have both Section 3 workers and Section 3 businesses. Now we want to promote the opportunities for Section 3 workers. In the past, Section 3 targeted PHA residents and kind of primarily focused its energies there. And we know that a lot of HUD-assisted communities aren't residing in a PHA. They could be voucher holders, or they could be other low-income individuals in a community. And so the new rule cites Section 3 workers more broadly. They can be low or very low-income individuals. And to qualify as such, the worker's income for the previous calendar year needs to be below the income limit that's established by HUD, which is based on the area median income. Alternatively, a Section 3 worker could be a participant in the Department of Labor's Youth Build program. And finally, a Section 3 worker could be employed by a Section 3 business concern, which brings us to that definition. So within the Small Business Administration and a number of other entities that try to promote disadvantaged groups, there are often businesses that are minority owned or women owned or just disadvantaged business. They have different qualifiers there. And so per the Section 3 definition, a Section 3 business is defined by checking one of the three boxes here. So at least 51% or more of the business is owned by low or very low income persons. 75% or more of the labor hours are performed by Section 3 workers, or can qualify as a Section 3 business if 51% or more of the business is owned by residents of public housing or Section 8 assisted housing. Next slide, please. So in order to meet the requirements of the Section 3 rule, a grantee must keep track of the labor hours for a given project. And so within public housing financial assistance, it's not project-based, but the different work that is assigned through the administration of the grant must meet the following targets. So the total number of Section 3 labor hours over the total labor hours must equal 25%. Additionally, we have targeted Section 3 labor hours, and that percentage must equal 5%. So a labor hour is the hours worked by an employee within the public housing financial assistance by using public housing financial assistance within that fiscal year. And the targeted worker under the public housing financial assistance is either a resident of public housing, a resident of another property that's project managed by the PHA, or a youth build participant. And the reason why we have targeted Section 3 workers specifically called out here is that those workers are prioritized. So we ask the grantees that they try and employ these specific groups ahead of other groups in the area if their local laws are compliant with that. And we want to, once again, keep the dollars where we're investing. Next slide, please. So it's slightly different for community and development funding. So the metrics are still the same. The total number of labor hours for Section 3 labor hours is still targeted to 25%, and targeted Section 3 labor hours is targeted at 5%. But because we're not dealing with a specific public housing authority, we're not calling the targeted hours as being tagged to residents themselves. They are still likely going to fall within what's called the service area. So within the 1 mile radius around the project, anyone who lives in that general vicinity can be qualified as a targeted Section 3 worker. And once again, a youth build participant or an employee of a Section 3 business can be targeted. So these are different groups that we're asking our grantees to prioritize in their hiring. Next slide, please. Now, there are cases where our grantees are not able to necessarily fulfill the metric requirements for their respective grants. But we do want to see in all cases that our grantees are reporting qualitatively. We want them to make efforts that demonstrate this prioritized hiring that we had called out for. And so, this can include providing training or apprenticeship opportunities, engaging in outreach with job applicants or with contractors, providing a job fair, referring workers, supporting businesses, small businesses kind of starting up, providing bonding assistance, guarantees, or other efforts to help smaller businesses like Section 3 businesses be competitive. So there's, a list of 14 efforts that could be made in support of Section 3 and uplifting communities and bringing economic opportunities for communities if the grantee is unable to fulfill the metrics that we called out in the previous slide. Next slide, please. So we know that it's, just generally challenging to get everybody in the room that needs to be in the room. And so, if anyone is looking to identify how to access these opportunities, how to access the workers, we have a series of a list of websites here. So first off, to identify housing and public infrastructure projects, you can find these HUD grant recipients on our HUD Exchange website. So within that, they're typically states or local governments that have received money from HUD, and they can then go on to tell you where those projects that they're building are located to direct you to where you can potentially find work. Additionally, a separate grant program is our Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes. And we have a list of grantees on the website, at the second bullet. Once again, those grantees are the ones that can direct you to the locations where the work might be. And then finally, your local public housing authority is always receiving money from HUD. And so the list of PHAs can be found within our Office of Public and Indian Housing. Now, if you're from a city or state that's not a direct recipient of HUD funds, it's likely that your state is. And so the recommendation there is to go to your state and identify any assistance that may have been received by them to determine where some Section 3 opportunities may be. Next slide, please. Now, resources generally can be found on both our government site, HUD.gov, and then our contractor site, HUD Exchange. And so any sort of tool that's developed should be linked between the two of them. If you are, a contractor or subcontractor and you're looking for ways to track your Section 3 labor hours, there are tools to simplify that process and guide you in how to report out on those values. For a Section 3 worker or a Section 3 business to self-certify as such, there are certification forms that could be used. There are ways that folks can denote that they are of a certain income level or that they reside within the public housing authority network in their area without having to expose what their actual income is. So if they can just quickly fill out one of those forms, it's a way to maintain the proper record keeping that's associated with hiring Section 3 workers or utilizing Section 3 businesses. And finally, if your specific locality, your city, or your state needs support with how they can better support Section 3 and funnel the workers that need the work to the opportunities, it's often the case that the entities need some sort of Section 3 plan, and that can be fulfilled through a technical assistance request where our contractors can help to guide an organization on how they can be more successful in Section 3, thereby increasing the capacity of the organization's workforce to bring more opportunities to low-income communities. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that, though we prioritize the hires of these local communities, they still need to meet requirements for the skills needed for specific jobs. And so, we encourage you to use all the tools that are available, particularly on our HUD Exchange website. We have a resource hub where you can filter the different resources by state. And within that, you can identify trainings, job aids, sample forms, local resources, local training programs, things like that. Additionally, we partner with the Department of Labor, and through them, you can identify local apprenticeship programs through, Job Corps, Youth Build, apprenticeships.gov. There are also partnerships, locally, potentially in your neighborhoods with minority serving institutions or community action partnerships, and even community colleges. So we encourage you to build up your skills through those organizations when applying to any sort of Section 3 opportunity. And, on our end, we encourage, workers to connect with HUD grantees, developers, and also Section 3 businesses. And you can find a number of small businesses, and they're not necessarily denoted as Section 3 because the label isn't necessarily there, but through the Small Business Administration, they keep a log of different small businesses across the country and can serve potentially to to provide small scale opportunities to individuals looking for job opportunities or business opportunities, and training as well. Next slide. Now, a couple cities here that have earned positive accolades are the Chicago Housing Authority and City Build in San Francisco. Now, both of these grantees, they've received HUD funding, and, you know, with a combination of HUD funding or local dollars, have developed workforce resource centers. And so these different centers allow for workers to not only find job opportunities, but to receive the supportive services that they might require to start some employment. So they can help you identify trainings or other opportunities. Additionally, you can get career coaching. Sometimes they have specific partnerships with local entities. The Chicago Housing Authority, for example, has a partnership with the Chicago Transit Authority and also with local unions. Sometimes it can be challenging in certain states to work with or to enter a union to become a member there. And so being able to navigate something like that is an example of a support services that workforce development agencies, you know, statewide, from state to state, it can provide. So no matter what state you're in, you know, a good first step is to try to tap the resources within your workforce development agencies. Next slide, please. All right, we're at the end here. So if any of you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Well, thank you, Jasmine. I have a question. Yeah. As someone who, well, first of all, I had never heard of Section 3 until I met you recently. I have a passion for housing outside of my 9-to-5. I invest in community and try to provide housing in under-resourced communities. This has been around since the 60s, and I'd never heard of it. So when I met you and you talked about Section 3, I went straight to my housing and community development team. It was like, do y'all know about this? Right? Why, you know, there's a lack, from what I've seen, a lack of awareness, plus a combination of misconceptions for justice impacted people when it comes to HUD. Like anything HUD is off limits if been like me, been formerly incarcerated. So we don't even look at that stuff. So there's a question in here somewhere, getting into it. But this goes to calling. I'm just so excited about the information you're sharing. So this goes to calling out, as we talked about in the previous segment, justice impacted groups. And so in your slides, and then in looking through the brochure, it talks about how contractors find employees through spreading awareness to people in the area where the HUD assistance is spent. So if someone is a directly impacted member of the community and they want to pursue a Section 3 opportunity during the recruitment process, how might our past conviction history impact our ability to participate?
I mean, you should still be able to participate. There are protections, you know, in place where, you know, even those who have had a conviction history are still eligible candidates for these opportunities. The only caveat is, you know, once again, you just need to meet the skills requirements as anyone would.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And again, if you could hang on for more questions at the end, if we have time, I'd appreciate it.
Sure thing.
And with that, we're going to go into our last segment of the day. Investment in communities through competitive and statutory funding are two essential ways we can help drive equity. Investment also means, however, technical assistance and opportunities for small businesses who can do business directly with the government to bring solutions to scale in their own communities. Often for those of us who own a small business, myself included, finding the pathway to opportunity and full participation in the economy can be impacted by a lack of local support, mentoring, or frameworks of scaling. I'm encountering all of those above. These are exactly some of the gaps that the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Justice and Equity seek to address each day. So fresh off their 2024 Justice Week, EJE advises the Secretary of Energy on the impact of energy policies, regulations, and DOE programs on minority businesses, communities, minority institutions, and specific segments of the U.S. population. So with us today is Shalaya Morissette, Chief of the Minority Business and Workforce Division at the U.S. Department of Energy, where she operates within the Office of Energy Justice and Equity, connecting with thousands of organizations serving small businesses within the energy industry. She has a macro level of understanding of the challenges and opportunities to drive significant change within the clean energy sector through policy, community, and education. Shalaya, we look forward to learning from you, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. We can go to the next slide. So many people will ask me, how in the world did you get here? What do you know? So this is a little bit of information about me and my background. I come from, before this, never being in government. So I come from the private sector. I understand business. I came out of utilities as well as higher education. I was a teacher prior to this. I was teaching 11th and 12th graders, a curriculum that I helped write, which was engineering with energy in mind. And it was ever apparent that we as a nation don't understand the energy around us, but most of us pay an energy bill. So I came into this to really make change, to make sure people were educated and knew what was happening and knew about the opportunities that are coming. Even with administrative changes, energy is going to be something that's not going anywhere. So with that, Shalaya is my first name. Don't mess it up. It's Princess Leia with a sh, Morissette like Elena. So if you ever see me out in the world, please come up to me. Please introduce yourself. I'm happy to help you wherever I am. I speak a lot publicly. Next slide. So with that, we are talking 1977 when the agency was established. Back in the 70s, we had an energy crisis. And even back then, the internal joke is that Congress knew that there needed to be an Office of Energy Justice, but they called it the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity. So we recently changed the name within the last year to Energy Justice and Equity. My little office has a budget that's less than $30 million, whereas some of our programs have just one opportunity out there worth $30 million. But back then, Congress knew that they needed this office. We've been here ever since, even with name changes. So we really are here to educate, right? But more than that, we need to make sure that the secretary is advised of all things that are happening in government and in industry. So that is my job, to help businesses and people know about opportunities here. Next slide. So basically, we're ensuring that every community, particularly historically underserved and underburdened populations, benefit from clean energy and energy efficiency investments. That does not mean that I have any money. Let me be clear. Our money is small compared to some of our other offices. We have offices like our state community energy programs that have over $18 billion in their budget line. That's billion with a B. My job is to make sure, hey, know where all of those dollars are and then tell businesses about those dollars. So our mission for our office is really focused on advancing equity by addressing energy affordability, creating access to clean energy jobs, and ensuring environmental justice. This really does align with the broader DOE mission of fostering sustainable energy solutions while also addressing economic and social inequities. One thing that people normally don't know that we do is we supply nuclear weapons to the Department of Defense. So I say we are the second largest agency, but we're better than them because we supply them with weapons. We also break them down. We move them about the nation. It's a very interesting thing that's not publicly driven, but you should know that that's what we do. Next slide. So the workforce crisis. We have one, folks, if you didn't know it, but I'm sure you do. It feels like it's everywhere. So in the energy sector, it's really driven by the shortage of energy workers, which slows down our progress in energy projects and production. The demand for energy talent is growing. The sector is also expecting to lose a substantial portion of its existing workforce due to retirement and sort of a mismatch between available talent and industry demands. We're in a sweet spot where if you get in right now, you will be in a better place 5 years from now, no matter what happens. We're going to use more energy. We're going to produce more energy. There will be new innovations. It is pretty promising if you're out here reading everything that's on the news and in the newspapers and everything that you hear from your local utilities. We won't stop producing. So next slide. This is Building America's Clean Energy Future Map. This is sort of the blueprint of what we've done. There's about 850 or more projects that we've already funded. Most people ask me, Shalea, where is the money? To the earlier point, we've issued a lot of the dollars already. Introducing you to a company that has our money is difficult for me because you get preferential treatment if I did something like that. However, the information is public. You can get access to every dollar that we've spent and who has it. That's sort of your in, but I want to be clear in saying, don't exactly ask a federal employee to make an introduction to a company that has their money. It's very difficult to do, and it can get you in a lot of trouble. It's a hurdle that I'm trying to navigate the waters with, because if they have our money, I want to make sure they know that there are groups of people that they should be working with that are willing to do the work and learn how to do it, especially if it's new work like offshore wind. But you can engage with the winners of the current funding. There are millions of good jobs out there that don't require college degrees. There's also projects through the Executive 14005, which is Build America, Buy America Act. Basically, we can't allocate funds or obligate them anything to do with iron, steel, manufactured projects, construction materials. They have to be produced here in the United States. There's no waiver for that. You can't get around it. So if you were thinking about this, where are you on this map and who's around you that you should be engaging with to get those dollars into your direct communities? Through Justice 40, they had to actually submit a plan, tell us how they were going to impact 40% of the benefits to the communities that they're actually working in. So that is accessible. We actually just published another map showcasing them, so you can read them all. I will make sure that I put it in the chat for everyone to see, but it's good information to sort of navigate you through these waters. Other examples of where we're making investments, if you're in, right now I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, but I'm based in Boston. Hyundai came here to Georgia and put in $5 billion worth of investments. That's 500 jobs. You had, and that was just one of their factories. Down in Savannah, they did another factory for 4.3 billion. That's 3,000 jobs. Cartersville, there's a manufacturing plant, $2.3 billion of investments. That's 1,900 jobs. Solar Cycle, that's another manufacturing, $344 million of investments, 600 jobs will come out of that. That's just Georgia. That's just one example, but there are so many more opportunities just looking at the 850 plus on this map. I'll make sure that you do get the link for this in the chat so you can go see it. It's live, active, and accessible. Next slide. All right. Community initiative by my lovely group really focuses on creating pathways to sustainable careers in the energy sector for individuals involved in the justice system, including those with felony convictions. It's really important. Recognizing that the growing demand for skilled trades in the energy industry, this really promotes blue collar roles, electricians, wind turbine technicians, solar PV installers, pipeline operators. The list is really long. Bridging the gap in jobs to increase employment accessibility, providing training resources, and improving awareness of funding opportunities. That support, that's really what we thought of when we went into this initiative. We cannot directly mandate hiring decisions by employers. We know that. That is a massive hurdle that I have not figured out how to get around completely, but I am committed to supporting partnerships that create more skilled and inclusive energy sector jobs. So we're encouraging collaboration between nonprofits, employers to address the growing workforce gap. If we don't get prepared for it, we will be left behind. So it's vital to our success as a nation. Next slide, please. All right. A lot of our information comes from labor stats. So Bureau of Labor Stats tells us that the top 10 jobs are out here. These are just 10 that are friendlier to second chance communities. The energy sector, of course, has everything. High paying jobs. If you know someone working at a utility company, they're probably making six figures. If you, and I say that on both sides, I'm talking management personnel to in the field personnel, with or without overtime, they are hitting the six-figure mark. That's where I came from. It was a great job, great benefits. Some of them will pay for you to go back to school. Anything that you want to do within those organizations is usually accessible within 2 years to move around and learn something new, which I always think is great. Utility companies happen to be the gatekeepers to how we get to clean energy. Our grid is controlled by them. And although it can stop us, they can also be really helpful to increasing the workforce. So I'm constantly working with them on how we can get folks into those jobs, particularly with line workers, plumbers, definitely electricians. It's projected that there'll be 80,000 jobs year over year for the next 40 years just in electrical work. That's 80,000 jobs each year. It's an insane amount of jobs that we are not prepared for, but we need to. So every opportunity is not necessarily the same in each state. So when you look at this, these are projected for long-term stability and unlikely to be replaced by AI, and they're very difficult to outsource overseas. So that's why we selected this list to show you today. Very accessible. Next slide, please. Lovely resource page. This is not the end of the presentation, but I wanted to make sure that you had eyes on it. This has links to our Second Chance Toolbox. It's sort of one-stop shop for the resources for jobs and energy. The Department of Energy, we have an Office of Jobs. They produce a report every year since 2016. They've put this out. So it will tell you, when you look at it, construction jobs increased double the amount for the nation. So we had 4% increase, the nation had 2% increase. So massive amounts of opportunities there. That is also in this list. So just make sure you take a look at it if you're interested. Next slide, please. I just want to talk about some of the actual opportunities that are available. Career Skills Training Grant Program, that had a pot of $10 million, and it was basically partners with nonprofits, and they provide training to equip individuals with disadvantaged communities for a certain skill set within energy. We had never done it before. Department of Energy, if you look back, hasn't done a tremendous amount in the workforce training piece. They've been heavily focused on innovation. Because we produce about 25% of the nation's research and development, that's where our eyes were looking. And so only recently with this administration have we really honed in and said, we're going to try this and see if we can do it right. So the other one that we did was energy auditor training. This was also a grant program for $40 million, and we were trying to increase the workforce skills for building energy efficiency. We needed more professionals. We still do. To do these audits, we sort of are establishing a baseline of where we are. How much energy are we using? What are the projections? And that's in manufacturing, commercial, housing, all of the goods. What are we doing? So if you're looking at this, this is not going to be found in your typical grants.gov. This is going to be found on a completely different website. This is actually going to be found on herox.com, and I'll make sure I put it in the chat so that you have it. It's an interesting way to issue funding. It has a lower dollar threshold, but your ability to apply is different. You can use a 2-minute video to apply. You can use a slide deck to apply. It's different for each opportunity, but it really lowered the threshold of you having to write 40 pages as a response to one of our funding opportunities. So I love prizes, so I'll make sure that you get it. Next slide. Another prize, the American-Made Good Jobs in Clean Energy Prize. This is wow, there's a lot of money in this one. When I look at this, this is actually putting together partnerships. So in order to participate, you need to be working with a labor union, an energy employer, a community-based organization, some sort of public entity, and a workforce provider. So if you are an organization and you want to focus in on creating quality, clean energy jobs, that's the opportunity for you. We will actually pay you for your planning phases. So instead of sitting around the table and saying, we'd love to do this, this, and this, and not getting paid for your time, we recognize that everyone should be compensated for their time. So that is in the whole rollout of this. We will pay you for that time. The other one that is here is your Work Opportunity Tax Credit. It's a federal program for hiring individuals with criminal records. The opportunities do not explicitly say second chance community or background friendly. However, they do emphasize training for disadvantaged communities. So that's just an important note. I don't like to give you the fluff. I'm trying to get to the meat of these things for what you need to know. Just know that. Read the fine print. The best advice I can give anybody when you engage with the Department of Energy or any federal agency is to read, read, read. We put everything in writing. It's a lot, but it's worth it. You can get all of your questions answered if you read it through. But next slide. Giving you a list here of internal stakeholders at the Department of Energy. I talked about the Office of Jobs, that's what we call it. Energy efficiency and renewable energy. That used to house weatherization, meaning your windows, your solar, your rooftop stuff. We moved that over to state community energy programs. And so EERE does a lot more research. And then, of course, falling into the fossil energy and carbon management and manufacturing and energy supply chain. These 4 offices alone, and really the last 3, have about $75 billion in their budget total. So thinking about that, there's a lot of money there, a lot of opportunity. Next slide. So this last slide is really a master list of external stakeholders that we've been working with, people that have received dollars, all of the goods. So I just wanted you to have that. But with that, the last slide here, next slide, is contact information. James Mosley is on my team. You may have seen Ben speak before. You can contact us. That QR code is to my information. If you call me on my cell phone, I'm probably not going to answer because I'm on a plane or I'm doing something like this. But if you send me an email, I do respond to every single email. So with that, thank you.
No, thank you, Shalea. I heard a few times you say, there's a lot of money here, so I'm not going to wait to take a chance on seeing you walk down the street. I'm going to get with you in this QR code right away. I'm not waiting. So, as a matter of fact, I got people texting me right now, like, right before you sent the code, was like, how do we get in contact with us? So your phone going to be ringing off the hook, I guarantee you.
Okay.
Make sure I funnel those people right to you. So thank you. I'm really excited about all this information. One follow-up before we get to, I guess, a general Q&A. For many in the reentry workforce space, the Department of Energy, was never on our radar. You presented a lot of information, a credible amount of resources and frameworks already today. I'm curious as to what recommendations you have for directly impacted business owners on where to begin at the local and state level.
So most states, I'll say this, most states have a state energy department. That's where we like to funnel the money to first, and then it's dispersed. So there are a few states, if you are in Mississippi, Florida, and Kentucky, you may have some issues. Contact me directly if you're in those states, and I will help you navigate those waters, or someone from my team will. If you are a business and you want to get in the game very quickly, I put a link in the chat. It is to theherox.com. These are the prizes that have a lower dollar threshold, but it helps you establish some past performance. Government is risk averse. It's like giving your kid the keys to your brand new Mercedes, right? It's not going to happen. It's a hard no. But if you start them off small, you give them the junk car, right? Somebody's cousin's car, and they do all right, then you graduate them and elevate them to the better car. So thinking that through, that's the same way that government works. We would prefer that you start out small, show us that you can manage the money appropriately, and then you really get some skin in the game with the larger opportunities. Teaming and partnerships is a big deal. We have a lot of public teaming partner list. Just about every opportunity that comes out of Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE, has a teaming list. You add yourself to that list. Other people can see it. We can also see it internally. It basically says you have a willingness to work with others. You're willing to collaborate. Really, really important. Put yourself on that list.
Thank you. And we're going to transition to general Q&A. I'm trying to monitor and if people can help, but I do have a question for everyone right now. For each of you, Paige, Jasmine, and Shalea, where do you see future opportunities within the states for the momentum already created in the current administration? All of you mentioned what's kickstarted under the Biden administration. So what do you see coming next? And you can come off. All right. Sorry about that.
Yeah, there was an order. But the Section 3 program has been in place well before the Biden administration. So, I mean, it's not hopefully going to change. You know, it's, as I said earlier, it started in 1965. So the rule is still in place. And so the opportunities should remain consistent. The only caveat is that, you know, the different grants are still in place. So maybe the number of grants might change over time, but the formula funds will likely be the same.
I can respond from my perspective. One of the statements that I made during, earlier is that most of the funds from the infrastructure law have been awarded. So I think that the major opportunity moving forward is the implementation of those funds. And I want to be, even more specific about that very few of the projects that have been funded by the infrastructure law have actually broken ground. And one of the reasons that we've seen several states start to make investments from their highway funds in workforce development is because they are realizing the need. So I would suspect that over the next couple of years, as projects are being implemented and the time comes to actually hire workers on projects, that there is going to be more of a push from the states, from cities, to figure out how to actually train people in the construction fields and to get more people onto these projects. I think that's especially going to be true if we continue to have a tight labor market as we have right now. When you have a tight labor market, there's only two ways to get workers. One is to steal workers who already have other jobs, right? Or then that's all about convincing them that your job is better, right? And to be honest, it's hard. It's hard to, there are some jobs that, construction stacks up well against, it pays well, benefits if you're in a union, but it's a hard job, right? So I think that it's sometimes going to be challenging to bring, new people who have been in other fields into that workforce. The second option of how you bring people in a tight labor market is you bring people who are not currently in the labor force, right? And that is, a large part of the population that we're here talking about today. People who are justice impacted are often not in the labor force because they can't find opportunities in the current systems that exist. And these are jobs that don't tend to have as many restrictions as other fields. And so I think it is an opportunity. It's also an opportunity for, people who, for other, disadvantaged populations, like people who don't have a degree beyond high school because there's not as much formal education that's required for these jobs. So that's really where I think people will be looking, is how do we bring people out of the, bring people who are not currently into the labor force into some of these jobs. And that's going to require investments in workforce development.
Thank you. I have missed this robust conversation in the chat, in the comments. So continue to put questions in the comments. If you have something you'd like me to ask, please specify that. But I'm just getting caught up. There's a exchange of information going on, and our panelists are also dropping links in there. Yes, the slides will be provided after this conversation. I want to keep it going. We have a few more minutes for questions. And this goes to everyone, but I want to start with Jasmine, because one of your slides talked about on the Section 3 part stuck out to me. So how do each of the initiatives you've shared address wraparound supports for workers, and how flexible are these funds for these purposes? And I can't remember the slide, Jasmine, but it was one of them that talked about the outreach and stuff for Section 3 jobs and people who qualify for them. But some of those people may need other supports that allow them to take a job. So can you all address that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, Section 3 independently doesn't have adjacent or supportive services tagged to it. The different grantees that are awarded the funds that may trigger Section 3 could have resources. So I would, encourage anyone who, works in a Section 3 capacity to reach out to their local, workforce development agencies. If they are residents of public housing authorities may have those supportive services. But, as I said earlier, Section 3 doesn't provide funding. It's just a requirement. So we have to kind of look around the other kind of HUD services to identify those supportive services that we understand are necessary for a lot of folks in those communities. You're muted, Tony.
Yeah, I haven't figured it out. So I was just saying, Paige or Shalea, if you wanted to address it. But I know one of you, and I should have written it down, had mentioned wraparound services in one of your slides. Some other than Jasmine, I can't remember who, but if either one of you wanted to.
It's that had to be.
What'd you say, Shalea?
I said that had to be Paige. We're not doing the best job at wraparound services for our stuff, but I will tell you things to look out for the last question were the NEVI plan. So it's a National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan that is in each state. They issued their approvals last year. So for the next 5 years, they're going to receive funding to build out the infrastructure for electric vehicles. So it's coming. There are certainly jobs there. And that's in every state. All the states were approved.
Yeah. So I talked about supportive services in a couple of different senses. Number one is that, if you looked at our report on how to bring underrepresented populations into good paying construction jobs, supportive services are the number one recommendation. The type of supportive service varies depending on the particular population. So for example, we found that for people who were justice impacted, that mental health services were more important than for other subpopulations, for example, that we looked at, like, opportunity youth or something like that. And we have a list in the report of the major supportive services that we found to be most important for various underrepresented populations. But with the main message being, like, they're all really important. They're all critical to getting underrepresented populations into these good paying jobs. And the second way that I mentioned them is that they are an allowable expense under our federal highway formula funds. And so these state DOTs can, and we have encouraged them to spend their highway formula funds on supportive services, which include, childcare, temporary lodging, work clothes, emergency cash assistance, all kinds of things. And the best examples will be in those case studies that I sent out. Each of those case studies details the types of supportive services that are being funded. So certainly think that those are critical for the work moving forward.
Thank you. We're going to have to start to close out here. As we draw our time together at the table to a close today, I want to start by thanking our incredible guests, Paige, Shalea, and Jasmine. I feel like I just had personal tutors and advisors. So I'm pretty sure the resources and expertise shared today will lead to a deeper understanding of our consumer rights and protections. For the whole series, it's hard to believe this is the final one for the calendar year, and we've certainly closed out with some powerful pathways to economic mobility. As a reminder, this week there are 2 more ways you can engage with 2 federal agencies we have already heard from earlier this year in our speaker series. If you'd like to learn more from the Department of Labor regarding apprenticeship opportunities, and I see people in the chat talking about apprenticeships and internships. Please join us. They are hosting an information webinar this Thursday at 1 p.m. You have to go to the Workforce GPS website to register for that. And then we are also bringing back last month's guest from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at 3 p.m. this Thursday. So both are on Thursday. The CFPB wants to hear directly from each of us about tips and leads for potential enforcement work to address the financial harms experienced by each of us who are directly impacted. If you do not want to miss these opportunities, just based on what I'm seeing going on in the chat and on my phone text messaging. So come spend Thursday afternoon with two important agencies that contribute to the economic mobility for each of us. Instructions to register are going to be in the chat, and these events, along with all resources from today, will be distributed by way of email, and they will be on our JCC website. We have been given a wide variety of ways today we can advocate for additional investments in our communities. This is how we create collective impact. And so before we adjourn, please use this QR code that will be on the screen shortly, on the final slide of the screen, to complete our survey. And let us know your feedback from today. And as always, if you haven't done so, follow us on social media. And please remember to share the opportunity to join the JCC with your circle. So more ways to elevate your experience and expertise are coming this month, and the table is open to all. So thank you for joining us today, and have a great week. Peace, everybody.